contrary, we are regressing. Land is being usurped by the state for urbanization. Land is being usurped by the state on behalf of corporations. Land is being usurped by corporates for their own profit directly. So there is a huge pressure on land, and there are huge struggles on land that I'm sure people would have spoken to you about over the last week or so that you've been here. Now, if you look at the question that I came on at the beginning about one similarity that we have on why universal programs work better than targeted programs. We have this subsidized ration scheme where we give a ration card or a BPL card, a below poverty line card. And the percentage of poor who do not have this ration card is as high as almost 30% in Orissa. The all India average is about 19.1%. Percentage of poor with BPL cards is about 36%. And percentage of non-poor who have BPL or AY cards is close to 60%. So a large number of non-poor have access to these cards. But because of political economy on the ground, because of caste, because of gender, because of the powerlessness with which many communities find themselves in being unable to exercise their right to food, you have the situation. The Indian poverty line that I spoke about, if you took, for rural, if you took $2 a day, that would be the line right at the top. If you took the World Bank poverty line of $1.25 per day, that is the second line. If you take the Indian poverty line, it's right there. And if you look at what is it that people are consuming at this poverty line, which is the 30th decile threshold in rural areas, this is before the Tendulkar line was drawn, it was just about 17 rupees per day. So a person who was spending 12 rupees a day in rural areas on healthcare, education, food was considered as poor. Somebody who was spending more than 13 rupees was not considered as poor. In urban areas it was 17 rupees. So if you were spending more than 17 rupees on healthcare, education, food, housing, everything, government did not consider you as poor. Those figures were revised to about 22 rupees for rural areas and 30 rupees for urban areas. And today the poverty line is little above 30 rupees for urban areas, which means if you're spending more than 30 rupees or 32 rupees in a city like Delhi on healthcare, education, food, housing, everything per capita, which means for a family of 550 rupees per day, then the government doesn't consider you to be poor. And government says that there has been a significant drop in the number of poor, and that very few people, and we are catching up with the rest of the world. Now, if you define your poverty line as a distribution line, if you define your poverty line as a starvation line, obviously you will have some of the least poor people in the world. And if you define your poverty line at 5 rupees or at 1 rupee, we can even eliminate poverty overnight. But this is a jugglery of numbers that the Planning Commission is doing. Fortunately for us, after a long struggle both in the courts and outside the courts, and this is one thing I must give credit to this government for, whether it succumbed to public pressure or pressure from the judiciary, we were able to de-link the poverty line from food schemes. Which means that today, as of today, except for food, and that hopefully will change today if the food security bill is passed, we were able, earlier, all the food schemes were linked to the poverty line set by the Planning Commission. That has now been de-linked. I now come to the food security bill that Colin had requested me to speak about. But before I do that, I want to talk a bit about the Supreme Court case, the PUCL litigation. What is the legal justification for the right to food in India? What has happened? What has the Right to Food campaign done? What has HRLN and the very, very fine legal colleagues who have worked with us over the last 13 years that this case has been on? A large measure of the success of this case is because of the fact that Colin Gonzalez is our senior counsel and has seen us through the last 13 years in this case. And the HRL legal team, along with the Commissioner's office, has consistently worked on the case for the last 13 years, which has led to a situation where the case now is poised at a very significant juncture, and as should happen, may even become infructuous with the passage of the Food Security Bill. There is a clear recognition of the right to food in international law. If you look at the International Covenant on Economic, Cultural and Social Rights, it says categorically that everyone has a right to adequate standard of living, including food, clothing, housing, etc. If you look at the Article 11.2 of the Covenant, it affirms that that there is a fundamental, everyone has a fundamental right to be free from hunger. India is a signatory to these covenants, and these provisions are binding and have been widely affirmed and relied upon in the Supreme Court. The jurisdiction on the right to food in India is extraordinary. And it is extraordinary because it hinges not on the fact that the Constitution has guaranteed a right to food. The Indian Constitution has not guaranteed a right to food. We do not have, our Constitution has fundamental rights and it has directive principles. We do not have right to food as a fundamental right in our Constitution. And I say that the jurisdiction on the right to food, as is developed over the years, is extraordinary because repeatedly, in case after case, the Indian Supreme Court and Indian High Courts have interpreted Article 21, which is the right to life, to enshrine the right to food. So you have a number of orders in the courts, not just in the right to food case which came in 2001, but beginning the mid-70s, we've had a series of orders, beginning with Maneka Gandhi, Chameli Singh, a whole lot of orders that you can get from HRLNs, which have reaffirmed the right. Over the years, the definition of how right to food, what constitutes right to food has also changed internationally. It has evolved. The UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights said the right to food is realized when every man, woman and child, alone or in community with others, has physical and economic access at all times to adequate food or means of its procurement. The UN Special Rapporteur in 2001, John Ziegler, he defined the right to food as a right to have regular, permanent and unobstructed access either directly or by means of financial purchases to quantitatively and qualitatively adequate and sufficient food corresponding to the cultural traditions of people to which the consumer belongs, and so on and so forth, and which ensures a physical and mental, individual and collective fulfilling and dignified life free from anxiety. There are three dimensions today on the right to food that are recognized globally. There is a dimension of access, there is a dimension of availability, and there is a dimension of absorption. There are three elements to the right to food. When we talk about the right to food, there are these three clear elements. There's access, there's availability, and there's absorption. When we talk about access, we mean, do people have access to food or the means to acquire that food? Either I should have food or I should have the money to go out and acquire that food, or the means or the labor to exchange that for food, or something which allows me to acquire that food. The second issue is availability. I may have the means to acquire the food. I may have money, but I may not have availability of food, which is what happens in a disaster zone or a famine. Suppose you were on an island and you had $100,000 with you, but if not a grain of grass grew on that island, then you would not have availability of food grains, even though you had the money to access that food grains if it was available. Now, assuming that you had both access and availability, the food grains you had access and you had enough food to eat, but for some reason the food that you consumed, you could not absorb that food, you would still be food insecure. Suppose you were a child who had chronic incidents of diarrhea, and whatever food goes into the body is excreted out. Suppose you had a deficiency of micronutrients that did not allow you to absorb the food properly. Suppose you were chronically ill, you had cancer or tuberculosis or HIV/AIDS, because of which the food that you had access to and it was available to you was not absorbed in your body. Then you are food insecure. Now, why I say this is because often we look at nutrition security in conjunction with food security. We think that if everybody had access to food, the problem of nutrition security would be resolved. We forget that, as I put it, the relationship between food and nutrition is like the relationship between textbooks and education. Textbooks are a necessary but not a sufficient condition for education. You need textbooks, there's no doubt about that. But textbooks alone are not enough for education. There are many other key determinants of nutrition other than food, when you look at the access, availability and absorption dimensions. So for instance, if you look at the absorption dimension, access to potable drinking water is a very key determinant of nutrition. Access to good sanitation is a very key determinant of nutrition. Access to primary health care of good quality is a very key determinant of nutrition. And often when we talk about food, and particularly activists in India, we have somehow abandoned nutrition security and the other key determinants of nutrition. And that is a mistake that the rest of South Asia should not make. And this is a message that I consistently carry when I travel with me. I'm going to, I went to the invitation of the National Judicial Academy of Nepal. I spent 2 days in Nepal talking to members of the Constituent Assembly and Supreme Court judges on how the right to food could be incorporated or inculcated into the Nepalese constitution, which is being drafted at that stage. And I will be going to Nepal again this week, later this week. I'm there between 24th and 27th, again talking to the National Human Rights Commission, talking to Supreme Court judges, talking to members of the Constituent Assembly, people who are involved in the right to food issues in Nepal, particularly on law and legislating. And when they ask me what is it that we should do, the first thing I say is that don't make the mistake that India has done. Look at nutrition security comprehensively. Don't look at nutrition security only as food. Nepal is going in the right way because they are planning to include, so far as I know, if the constitution gets firmed up and approved, there is still some uncertainty about that, as our colleagues from Nepal can say. But they are looking at the right to food in a very comprehensive manner in the early drafts. They are looking at the issue of land, they are looking at the issue of agriculture, and I tell them that include nutrition. Because we have made this mistake, and our Nepalese brothers and sisters must not make this mistake that we have made, because we have set ourselves back by decades by not focusing on the other key social determinants. If you look at international law and children's right to food, if you look at the Article 21 of the International Covenant, again, it talks about the steps to be taken by the state for the healthy development of the child. Article 24.2 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which all state parties, including India, are signatory to. State parties shall take appropriate measures to diminish infant and child mortality,